Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 7th of March 2023. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. And this is a particularly special show because this is the last in my series. I have been running these live streams every Tuesday for a number of years now. And of course, I started a few years ago running them once a month, and then we went to the weekly. And I've had all sorts of guests on and discovered a lot of different things over the time. But we are now coming to the end of that sequence as I move back to the UK. And so this is a bit of a special show insofar that we'll be able to think a little bit broader perhaps, as well as looking at the data. But I do want to focus in on the data that's come out today, specifically from the RBA. And I will just remind you, as I normally do, that this isn't financial advice or legal advice. It's general conversation only on the channel. We do moderate this chat. And this is as at the 7th of March, if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to ask a question or get my attention, use that Walk the World to make sure that I see it in my queue. And I've also enabled Super Chat if you'd like to make a contribution to what we do around here. We'll be making more shows in the future, or indeed get your question to the top of the list. Super Chat's a way of doing that too. Anyway, I thought we should start by just looking at what the RBA said today, because of course they put the cash rate up by 25 basis points to 3.6%, and has also increased the interest rate on exchange settlement balances by 25 basis points to 3.5%. In other words, the money that the banks have are effectively parked at the RBA and getting 3.5%, and of course that money is charging them 0.1 or 0.25%. So the banks are making a nice little mozza on that under the term funding facility. And they went on to say that the global inflation issue remains high. The monthly CPI suggests that inflation has peaked in Australia. Well, we'll see that. The last monthly one, of course, was down slightly, but of course the monthly one is also a bit wobbly. And they do say that goods inflation is expected to moderate. Services inflation, though, remains high with strong demand for some services. And of course, rents is still there as well. And they've got still a forecast for a decline this year and next to around 3%. But when? On mid-2025. And they say that medium-term inflation expectations remain well anchored, whatever that means. And then they went on to say that growth in the economy has slowed, GDP 0.5% and 2.7% over the year, and it's expected to continue below trend the next couple of years. Consumption has slowed, but business investment remains positive. The labour market is tight, although conditions have eased, and the unemployment rate remains close to a 50-year low. And wages growth continues to pick up, although the board does remain alert to the risks of the prices wage spiral. Nothing there about the bank being concerned about the company profit inflation spiral, which is, I think, something they should be talking about. And they went on to say that they operate with a lag. They recognise that monetary policy operates with a lag. And there's uncertainty about the time and extent of the slowdown in household spending. And household balances, though, are being affected by a decline in housing prices. They also mentioned the substantial savings buffers despite the saving ratio has dropped. And of course, those buffers are not equally spread across all households. And there's also a broader sense of uncertainty about global economy and how that's going to respond. They still underscored their return to inflation, and high inflation makes life difficult for people. And so they're targeting the 2 to 3% return. And they concluded by saying that they expect further tightening of monetary policy will be needed to ensure that inflation returns to target, and that this period of high inflation is only temporary. And then this is where the hint has been picked up by a number of analysts in assessing when and how much further interest rates need to increase. The board will be paying close attention to developments in the global economy, trends in household spending, and the outlook for inflation in the labour market, but they remain resolute in its determination to return inflation to target, and will do what is necessary to achieve that. Now, what's interesting about that was interpreted by a number of analysts as saying, hey, they're leaving the door open to a pause in April. But even Westpac said they think that's a little unlikely. and they're expecting a couple more rate rises. And I think that there's nothing here really that fundamentally changes the tenor of what the Reserve Bank is saying. It's just that they are leaving the door a little ajar, open to a little bit of flexibility because of the global economy. Of course, we know that the US is likely to slow. We know that recession is quite likely in the Eurozone and probably is already in the UK. So there are some external factors. And of course, we also know that China's growth is targeted now at 5%, which is a lot lower than previously. So all of those factors are in the mix, I think. Now, it's just worth thinking about this. So the official interest rates have now increased by 3.5 points to 3.6% since early May 2022, and that they're highest for over a decade, since being at 3.75% in June 2012. And this is the largest series of interest rate increases since the RBA gained its independence in the early 1990s. So this is pretty unusual, and of course it's all driven by the fact they took interest rates way too low post-COVID and then left them there way too long. Of course, other central banks did the same thing. And it's also worth reflecting to what extent the central bank here is actually really just mirroring and aping what the Federal Reserve and other central banks are doing. Whilst they can claim to be making policy for Australians, the truth is, of course, they're going to be having one eye over towards those other major central banks as well. Now, it's worth saying that after the announcement, the interbank cash rate futures did move. This is actually as at the close of business on the 7th of March. And now you can see that the peak of rates are actually in November at 4.01% and is expected to come down slightly by August 2024 to 3.665%, which of course is higher than today. So you can see here that the market is saying rates are going up further. They're going to stay high, and there's no real prospect of anything significant in terms of rate falls through 2023. And just on that, I did put a poll out on the channel to start with, asking when you think we might see the rate rise reversal starting. Is it going to be this year? Is it going to be next year? Is it going to be in 2025? Or is it impossible to tell? So be interested in your answers, and we'll cover that later in the show. Now, it's also worth thinking about the consequences of this, and CanStar put out quite a useful little memoir today. Borrowers to work 29 hours extra to cover 50% increase in monthly repayments. So CanStar said they Reserve Bank's increased, 10th of increase, of course, and it shows that assuming the latest rate rise is passed on in full by lenders, someone with a $500,000 loan over 30 years will be paying about $1,500 more per month, or $12,000 per year in repayments than they were in April 2022. That's a 50% increase in repayments. That's a big number. And they actually broke it out at $500,000, $750,000, and $1 million. And you can see here that the increase in the repayments is 50%. No wonder that that's a significant issue for many people. And they say that on a typical income of $71,000, you'd need to work equivalent of an extra 29 hours a week or 348 hours per year to make up the shortfall. So it's a pretty significant shock to the system, and those shocks are beginning to show. Now, of course, the HIA put this release out before the RBA. Rate increases risk unnecessary slowdown, and they basically said that the lending indicators and construction are already weak. We don't want any more rate rises, but of course the HIA didn't get their way, and of course they talk in their book. It's also worth noting that consumer confidence for Morgan dropped a little, just 0.1%, but is really, down in the gutter still. And it's interesting that the Westpac Card Tracker Index that came out showed a reduction, and significantly, discretionary spending and discretionary services in particular are actually dropping. So in other words, people are spending less on things they don't have to purchase, and that would suggest that we are seeing a change in sentiment amongst households. And it's also worth just looking at this. This is from UBS and the ABS, and they showed that the different cohorts from 65 plus through to 55, 64, through to 45, 54, and 35 to 44 are having very different outcomes looking at the distribution of the extra deposits. And what's basically happening is that younger households are being squeezed to billy-o, whereas those who are older are actually less affected and they're actually doing rather better. So this is not equally spread across the whole of the community. And one of the things that I keep talking about is the unequal distribution of this impact. So the RBA has not said they want to cause a recession. Of course, in New Zealand, Adrian Orr has said he's trying to cause a recession. But in Australia, the RBA is saying they want to try and steer this careful path, but the impact will be different on different groups of households. And that's quite significant. Another interesting observation, which is worth looking at, this is from Tarek, is that the used car sales listings are significantly up, whereas the weighted used car price index is down. So this is perhaps an indication that people are actually now looking to shed some of their excess goods or cars or whatever to try and support their financial position. I see that in my surveys too. Households are definitely figuring out ways to try and make ends meet, dialing back on particular characteristics of spending, or indeed selling the second car or the caravan or the jet ski or whatever it is, anything to generate a bit of extra income. The other interesting factor and worrying factor which SQM reported today is that the average city weekly rent has gone way, way up. And in fact, Louis Christopher said he's never seen anything like it. Look at this massive rise here. Remember that this is effectively the listings rents, and this will take some time to flow into the ABS inflation data. But my expectation is that we will see considerably more risk to inflation from rents ahead. And one other thing, just to round out the conversation, this is from the recent discussion about superannuation. So the cost of the pension currently is about 55 billion, but the super tax concession is 52 billion. So we're close to spending as much on the super tax concessions as on the age pension. And it's also worth making the point that the changes that the Treasurer is talking about will add a small amount, but not a large amount, to this number in terms of reduction, a couple of billion. So quite soon, it's likely that we're going to have more superannuation tax concessions relative to the age pension, which to me seems a bit wacky, I have to say. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's quite an interesting observation too. Now, I will just briefly then touch on my mortgage stress data because I've updated the models. And for those of you who may not know, of course, I do survey households on a rolling basis. I'll continue to make those surveys available. We continue to run the weekly surveys and the models. And we take information to our core market model, and we can then slice and dice the data, and we can look at it through a number of different lenses, including our different scenarios. And we can look at things like mortgage stress, price trajectory, history, and buying and selling intentions, and migration data, and the other economic data. Put through the core market model, look at the different scenarios at a postcode level. Now, just on the one-to-one service, I'm still offering this service. There will be a hiatus over 3 or 4 weeks while I move, but I am still happy to have an individual conversation with people about a particular postcode using my data set. Can't give financial advice, but I can talk a little bit about what's going on at a granular level. And it is feasible to book a time via Zoom or phone, up to an hour, but you will need to pay for that because it's cost involved in doing the work. And we are 3 to 5 weeks away from really booking now. So if you're interested, send me a message via the blog. Now, let me just go on to the definition of mortgage stress because that's important, particularly now. There are lots of different ways of defining it, from 30% of income or taxable income. But of course, I define stress in cash flow terms, money in, money out. If households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items than income, then they're defined as stressed. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If renting, then rental stress. And investors with cash flow pressures are identified as stressed investors, and we aggregate the data to financial stress as well. And we look at both the percentage of households and count, but the latter is best probably when we look at it in the data set. Now, Roy Morgan came out with their mortgage stress number and said that by April 2023, assuming an interest rate of 3.85%, which is perfectly conceivable now, 1.45 million households, or 29.5%, could actually be in mortgage stress, and up 4.6% from February. And in my own data, rental stress is now up to 61.86%, so it's continuing to rise. Mortgage stress is at 46.7%, so it's rising again. And the household debt to income ratio is still very high. So we've got a real structural issue here in Australia. And so you can see now 46.74%, more rises. That's now 1.794. Rental stress up to 61.86% at 1.92 million. And financial stress at 44.35%. So again, more rises. And specifically here now in the ACT and in Victoria. Now, if we look at it across segments, you can see here that, again, young affluents and young growing families have a lot of issues. The young growing families and first-time buyers, mortgage stress. A lot of young affluents are actually dealing with rental stress, as are first-generation Australians. And the stressed investors are also there as well. And quite a few of the young affluents and professional investors, exclusive professionals, are actually also stressed. So you can see different segments are actually exposed at the moment. And just quickly, I'll run down the main postcodes. So you can see here that we've got New South Wales, Liverpool 2170 is now the most stressed in terms of count, with more than 12,500. Then we've got another New South Wales postcode at Campbelltown with more than 12,000. Then Toowoomba. And then we go to Western Australia, then we go to Victoria, down to the urban fringe there, places like Roxburgh Park and Mickleham, and then Narre Warren, and then across to the west, and then Victoria again, Berwick and Harkaway, and so it goes on. Cranbourne and other ones too. Pakenham, of course, is there too. And then we go to regional areas like Ballarat. So it's pretty widespread. The numbers are going up. If you look at rental stress, it's the same story. Melbourne is still there right in the centre with mortgage stress, then Liverpool, and then Toowoomba. And then we've got Queensland, sort of Southport and Labrador, Campbelltown, places like Mount Druitt, Waterloo and Zetland, Blacktown, Wentworthville, and then up onto the mid-north coast with Gosford, and then Coomera, Ipswich, and so it goes on. And then if we go to the stressed investors, again, no surprise, Melbourne is seeing it still. Then we've got Mount Claremont in the west. Then we've got Crow's Nest and Greenwich and places like that in New South Wales. Then the South Bank in Victoria. Then we've got Wentworthville, Fortitude Valley and Newstead in Queensland. Then Hornsby and Hornsby Heights in New South Wales, South Yarra. And so it goes on. So some of these more affluent areas like Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst are also feeling it now in terms of stressed investors, as well as Bundaberg, Cranbourne and places like that. And we've got Service Paradise as well. And then finally, with financial stress, which is, if you like, the aggregate, the postcode with the highest issue is Liverpool. Then we go to Toowoomba, then we go to Campbelltown, then we go to Cranbourne, Roxburgh Park. Melbourne itself, Mount Druitt, Point Cook and Werribee, and then Ipswich, and so it goes on. So that gives you a little bit of a flavour. It's really same old in terms of some of those same areas, but a lot of the same issues, of course, we're seeing now, only in more spades, because effectively more people are getting caught, the numbers are increasing, the density is increasing, and it's putting more people into more difficulty. Now, I will just briefly show you a couple of the stress maps just to cover that as well. So this is actually in and around Sydney, and you can see here that places like Liverpool are very much a hotspot, as showing on that earlier map. There are hotspots also at Ryde, out towards Parramatta, Cumberland, the hills, and if you pull out, you can also see some other areas too, where again we also have up towards the Hawkesbury, for example, there's an area there. We have obviously Campbelltown, and so it goes on. Lane Cove shows up. So it's not uniformly spread, but even places like Mossman, for example, and other other eastern suburbs are showing it too as well. So it's quite widespread. And if I pick another one, we'll just do Melbourne. And again, we're just zooming out from the centre of the city, and you can see again that we are seeing similar trends in terms of the outer suburban areas where a lot of the pain is. High growth corridors, lots of new developments, lots of people with big mortgages, lots of people working extra hours to try and get by. And you can see here that over in the east and the west and the north, Melbourne is definitely showing signs of stress now. And if you pull out a little further, you can see even regional areas like Ballarat are also on the list as well. So the point I want to make with all of this mapping is it shows you where the hotspots are. And the interesting question for me now will be to what extent there will be essentially price reductions because of the stress, because people have nowhere to go. And certainly I've spoken to a few debt counsellors in the last couple of weeks, and they're all saying in these hotspot areas they're getting more and more calls from people trying to work out what to do. So it is a pretty uncomfortable situation at the moment for a lot of people. And unfortunately, bearing in mind that I think it's likely that we're going to see more rate rises ahead, then potentially that's going to be a more significant issue too. So I guess that's what I really wanted to deliver tonight in terms of my analysis. I will be sending out the detailed postcode analysis to the Patreon subscribers tomorrow, and I'll continue to send that out each month. I hope to make another show next month. It'll be a recorded show rather than a live show, and I'll be updating the data in roughly real time. It might be a week or so late because of other things I'm doing in the UK, but that's the plan. So with that sort of part of the show out of the way, I want to just have a little bit of a look now and see what the chat's been up to, and see whether there are comments. And if you'd like to ask other questions, I'm happy to try and cover off a few other questions or issues. A very active chat tonight. I'm not sure how far I can go back. Jason said, that's a lot of money for the banking cartels. Yeah. So the truth is, of course, that the banks are likely to make about 30 billion of profit this year. What they are doing is deeply discounting a lot of those refinance mortgages. And of course, both the CBA and NAB have actually said that in some cases it's irrational what they're doing at the moment, but they're all doing it. We also know that some banks are actually phoning up existing customers and offering them a cheaper rate to keep them. So it reminds me of the old story about when does a bank actually phone you up and say, hey, I've got a better deal for you. Well, some of them are now, depending on individual circumstances. And the refinancing momentum is still quite strong. We saw that in the latest ABS data. But the banks are still making quite a lot of margin, even if the margin is more compressed now than it was last year. They're doing two things. First, they're actually still squeezing depositors dramatically. Only about half of the uplift has been passed on to depositor. And the other is, of course, that they're offering more extended mortgages so that effectively people will be paying more interest for longer. And unfortunately, I think the banks are really looking after their own bottom line and shareholders, which I suppose on one level you could say is fine because that's what they should be there for. But on another level, it's not necessarily that appropriate given what's going on at the moment. And we know that a number of households who are in limited means and with limited loan-to-value ratio or little equity now, because prices are still moving back, they're finding it very difficult to switch. And so they're mortgage prisoners. They're often paying a lot more than other people. So that's another factor to bear in mind. So while some people will be able to refinance, and we've got a mortgage cliff, of course, coming through, the July will be the peak. A lot of people going from fixed to variable rates at that point. There are a number of people who are locked out of switching and are stuck on high rates, some of those with non-traditional lenders. So it's getting very complicated, very difficult. And I think the overall impact on households will be quite significant, particularly those who are stressed. But nevertheless, the banks are still turning out a very significant set of profits. And so there was a question here about the worst case scenario. So I've got three scenarios, right? I've got a scenario that says, well, maybe the RBA does just one more rate rise and that's it. I've got a scenario that says they do another two or three. But we don't get a local recession, but we get an international recession. Maybe because of the US, maybe because of Europe. And we have another scenario where we say, well, actually, we get a recession here in Australia, and that recession then forces the RBA to begin to drop rates. But in doing so, of course, the damage will have been done. And I thought it was very interesting today that the RBA said that the monetary policy lag is significant. And certainly the research I've done suggests it's quite often somewhere between a year and 18 months between when interest rates are moved and it really hits household budgets. So that would suggest that next year is going to be the real hitting point for a lot of pressures. And by the way, delinquencies are still quite low at the moment. And of course, we've got high migration. And as some people are saying, well, that means that will economically support what's going on. And that means that households won't necessarily get into great difficulty. I have to say some households will be fine, but certainly in my particular analysis, there are other households that are going to be in significant difficulty ahead. And, to try and sort of unpick that, if I take a typical, let's just get this sorted out. Go there. Yeah, there you go. So I'm just going to show this one. This happened to be one I was looking at a little earlier on. So this is actually from my model. And I thought it was quite an interesting example because it's not necessarily, big postcode. This happens to be in the Adelaide city suburbs, about 3,000 households. But even with mortgage stress at 20%, we've got a lot of rental stress in this particular suburb. And overall, we've got household financial stress at about 44%. And if you look at the income calculations here, what you see is that disposable monthly income is around $4,000. And people are looking at 43.2% of their average disposable monthly income just to pay the mortgage. 43.2%, that's a lot. 27.5% for those renting. And the scenarios play out. So the best case scenario in 36 months cumulative, a very small rise, 3%, 4%. But the base case, which I think is more likely, is a further fall. And the worst case, if we got a local recession, would be a more considerable fall as well. So that gives you a bit of a flavour as to how I'm seeing things at the moment. And you have to come back to disposable monthly income because, of course, real income is going backwards in real terms. What I mean by that is that the inflationary effect is much stronger, above 7%, than wages growth, which is somewhere between 3 and 4% if you're lucky, or if in the public sector a bit lower. So what it means is that in real terms, people continue to go backwards, and that's another factor in the mix. Now, James made the point, and it's certainly true, that people in default on their mortgage can apply for early release of superannuation. You have to go through a whole set of processes, and you have to have that notice of foreclosure. So it's pretty onerous. And it's sort of right at the end, really, of the journey. And there has been a rise in the number of people accessing hardship-related superannuation. And it goes back to the fundamental question again as to, so what is superannuation for in the first place, right? And of course, Chalmers is trying to define it as income in retirement. Well, if you pull income out early because you've got a crisis, that's not going to help your retirement situation, is it? See what else we have in terms of other questions. Another one from James. Fewer properties for sale will actually raise house prices. Well, that depends, isn't there? We certainly have lower listings. Edwin and I covered that on Monday than previously. But there's a lot of stale property on the market. And a lot of that property is quite old and needs quite a lot of work. Now, those prices aren't necessarily rising. Whereas other more saleable property potentially could attract a higher price in some suburbs. But if you look carefully at the data points, prices are not rising in many areas, and in fact are continuing to fall quite fast in other areas. So I think those who are spruiking we've hit the bottom and prices are going to go higher, are really missing the point. I made a show earlier on today looking at Canada and what RBC said, and they basically said, well, it's not really going to see a massive turnaround in prices. We might have seen the worst of the falls. I think in Australia we're probably halfway down the falls, and I'm sort of pretty close to Chris Joy in terms of seeing what he sees in terms of prices continuing to slide for another few months yet. And I don't see that changing, unfortunately, and I don't think we're going to see a significant bounce in home prices other than marginal ones in a few areas where there are unique situations, and you have to go granular, as I often say. And this is a good one from Will saying, RBA begin to cut rates, sorry, but never. Yeah, it's unlikely that they're going to cut it this year, I think. It's more likely to be 2024, but if they do cut, it's not going to be a significant cut, and that's what RBC also made the point over, that we're not going to come back to ultra-low interest rates again. So rates will be a lot higher. We are structurally moved into a different environment than previously. And of course, I've argued on a number of occasions, it's credit availability and it's the cost of credit that actually drives home prices higher. If credit availability is high, interest rates are low, people can borrow more, and that means that effectively you can bid prices up. The reverse is also true. And of course, borrowing power is now 40% down from its peak. That means you can typically get 40% less by way of a mortgage. That's enough to significantly floor house prices, which is why my scenario is over 3 years. And looking at this one again, you can see here that there is a scenario that says we might see a small recovery later in 24 months or so if things go really well, but the most likely scenario is further fall. So I don't see a quick recovery. I don't think this is V-shaped. This is going to be a long, slow grind. And it's worth saying, I think, that this grind is going to take quite a long time to work its way through. I sort of have a 3 to 5 year view about what's going on. And I think that's the timeline that we should be thinking about if, in fact, we actually believe that ultimately prices will begin to move up again. It probably will eventually, but I think we're going to go sideways. And I'll remind you that post the GFC, the worst of the falls were 3 years after the event that happened, both in the US and in the UK. So this could take us a bit of a burn over a number of weeks and months and years. Okay, other questions? And so Rolf's talking about 15-minute cities. There's quite an interesting discussion to be had there. And of course, in some other parts of the world, they're actually making it harder for people to get around. So they're imposing geographic zones effectively, and then if you need to travel beyond them, you can't travel directly. They block roads and things like that. And in some areas in the UK, for example, they're now starting to charge people if they go longer distances. So it's an interesting question as to whether, in fact, we are beginning to see the start of, if you like, small geographic areas and then more control being imposed in those areas by councils. I have an issue with that. But in theory, there's an opportunity to maybe create more facilities locally rather than having to travel a lot. And that could be quite helpful from both an economic perspective and potentially also from a green perspective. But there are lots of issues and consequences, and I worry about the implicit controls that might be imposed in that scenario. How do they say she'll be right in British? Forever hopeful, I think, is probably the closest I got, which isn't anything as good as the Australian, but there tends to be still a lot of people who hope for the best and muddle along. The British are very good at muddling along. We do a lot of it. Ray made the point about housing stress in WA is up while rental stress is a little less. Yeah, it is interesting. There's a bit of a lag there because the rents were quite a lot lower to start with in WA. They went through quite a strong down cycle before COVID hit, and so there's a recovery path that's different from the East Coast. I think that's the reason. And I will just remind you, please, to like the post and share the post as well. Really appreciate all the support that I get, and it's very important to spread the word. And of course, you can watch some of the back catalogue. There's many thousands of shows in the DFA channel, and a lot of them are still very relevant. I was listening the other night to a show I did about 3 years ago and thought, still totally relevant. So do like the show and check some of the other things out. Okay, Rosella asked about young affluent, how they define. So young affluents are those people who have higher than average incomes, no kids, and quite often are living closer into the city. They might be in an apartment, or they might have a house, but it's about the level of income and the level of affluence that they've got. And quite often young affluents have, as well as a primary residence, they may well have investment properties. Some young affluents don't have an occupied property, they're renting, but they also have multiple investment properties. So that's sort of the characteristic there. Yeah, you could call them yuppies, I suppose, not a million miles off. Now, Mike asked about the impact a war with China could have on our scenarios. I haven't really incorporated that directly. I have, though, in my third scenario, the recession scenario, assumed that the economic momentum vis-a-vis China would dissipate considerably. And that's probably as close as I've got to trying to model this. I think beyond that, it's very difficult. And it's too non-linear, I think, to really form a view as to how that might play out. But clearly there are global risks in multiple fronts at the moment. Nickel made the point about scoring 2 summers in a row. Lucky you. Well, I don't know. The UK summer, it isn't really a summer. I mean, it's all relative. We do get longer days, of course, than in Sydney, for example, in the summer. But the weather is pretty bad at the moment. They've got snow there at the moment, and they're forecasting quite a lot of snow over the next few days. So I think it's going to be quite cool when I arrive. Be interested to see what the dogs think about snow. They've never seen snow, of course, here. But yeah, we'll have a few months to acclimatise before it gets really gloomy and dark in the middle of winter. But you don't get everything. I do like the climate here in Australia, other than the 3 or 4 months over summer when it's too humid. Whereas in the UK, you have a bad winter, so I suppose it's a matter of, you pays your money, you takes your choice. And Cookie Boy made the point, and I keep clicking that one, there you go. China predicts the growth by 5%, bad news for economies. Absolutely it is, yes. So they're basically trying to get households to spend more in China. So they're trying to turn the ship around towards consumerism rather than just more engineering investments. So they may not need as much steel, may not build as many houses or rail systems. That could all have negative impact on us in Australia, because they might need less steel and other things from us. Thanks, Will, for that. Appreciate that comment there. The new voice said, Scotland would be able to pick than England. Yeah, the thing about Scotland is, have you ever been to Scotland in the summer? They have clouds of midges all over the place. I'm somebody who attracts midges, so no, I think I'll stay south of the border. As Otto says, it swings and roundabouts weather-wise. You can suit up and they'll be fine. We'll see. Okay, so if there are other questions you'd like to chuck in, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we can spend a little bit of time just exploring some broader issues if you want. I do have a couple of other things I just want to say, and I think I'll just sort of start on that now. So, I've been making these shows in Australia for more than 6 or 7 years. I started with the occasional weekend show, particularly Property Imperative, talking about property, and I broadened the conversation to some of the economics and markets. I started doing live streams. Some of the first live streams were just in the same location here, but the kitchen, which is behind this green screen, was effectively the base that I was talking from. And in all the times I've done live streams, I've only had one failure. So there was one time when the internet went down 3/4 of the way through a show with Chris Bates, in fact, and we disappeared off air, but that's the only time that actually things have gone wrong on the show, which is pretty good, I think, a pretty good average. And so I've got to say the NBN has been quite helpful in terms of helping to make sure that the quality of the internet's reasonable. So that was quite good. And just in terms of the layout here, so of course this has grown a little bit now from what I had originally. This is quite a complex setup now because, of course, and it's worth just reiterating, I do actually create a lot of other content, and I also have another business where I actually make commercial videos for people. So that's part of the reason why the studio is as complex as it is. But you can see here that we've got multiple screens. We've got the monitors above to be able to monitor the audio and the luminance from the cameras, and it's all driven by me. So I don't have anybody else actually working behind the scenes. It's all one-man control, and in fact the control system is pretty simple. I have a series of buttons which we might sort of zoom in on. Yeah, so basically here these are the controls. This control and this control are the two control sets, and that actually allows me to switch everything around and to do all the other things I need to do. So this is literally controlled from my fingertips, and of course I'll have to I'll have to rebuild this for the new environment when I actually get there. And you might be interested to know I'm going to take the green screens, not because they're particularly expensive, but just because they're very convenient to have. I built all the green screens from, there you go, you can see the green screen there. I built the green screen which is behind me, and that actually allows me then to superimpose the rotating globe or the static globe when I'm actually making the shows. So they'll be going as well, and we'll be able to do some of that at the other end. So that's basically the setup. It's grown over the years, and those of you who've been following the show will know that we've introduced a bit more technology. Things like the overlays, things like the live chat, and also the ability to be able to pipe in multiple screens. All of those things have taken quite a lot of work behind the scenes to get it to work. So, this has grown quite a lot over recent times, and it's relatively sophisticated. Now, somebody said on Twitter, well, you don't need all of that to go live on YouTube, and the answer is, well, you don't. No, that's true. And it may well be that over the next few weeks my setup will be a lot simpler. So I do have a portable system, which is this device here. It's called a yellow box, and this actually is a built-in streaming and switcher. So I'm going to take this with me, and this will allow me then to be able to stream anywhere. I'll plug a camera in and a microphone in, and I can go live. So it won't be as sophisticated, but it allows me to keep the shows going, and that's what we'll be doing initially. And then as I get the rest of everything sorted out, I'll be able to then build out the studio, but it will take a little time to do that. And it's interesting, a lot of comments there about the studio. It's good to see. Yeah. And thank you very much for that super chat. I appreciate that. Thank you. Cookie Boy said DFA FM. Thanks for some of the other comments there. Went to school with Tarek. You say about him, you really enjoyed a long discussion. Yeah, I will. And Tarek and I will continue to make our shows. We won't do it for a couple of Fridays because of the move, but we will certainly get back. And Carrie says, really good average, all of the good things making a video channel. Yeah, it is multiple things, right? And by the way, it's really important to get the content as well as just the technology. It's very, very significant, of course, because you can spend all your time and effort on the technology, but not actually worry about the content sufficiently. And I've tried to focus to make sure that what I'm talking about is relevant and appropriate, but the technology enables me and helps me to get my message across. So that's the way I've thought about it. Now, Leo asked, what mortgage stress if rates go to 4.1? About another 250,000 households would fall into cash flow stress. Remember, I define it in cash flow terms. So that would put it considerably higher than where it is now. And the other point is that there'll be more severe impacts on those who are already stressed. There's a limit to what people can do. They can dial back their spending, they can get another job. There was a report the other day that more people were getting jobs. They can do all sorts of other things to try and get by, but eventually there is a point beyond which they cannot cross. And so it's just not the number, it's also the depth of stress that people have. And I worry that we're going to see defaults rising. And it's a bit like we discussed with Tony last evening, that there is, a more perfect storm now, which is probably going to come. Now, whether the rates will get to 4.1, who knows? Some people are calling no more rate hikes, others are saying another 2 or 3, and we'll see. But the markets are saying above 4. So yeah, it's going to continue, unfortunately, and it's going to be quite a problem. And yeah, people calling out, yep, it is a pan tilt zoom. I do have a couple of those. The doggy cam is another pan tilt zoom as well. So I can control it from where I'm here, and then I've got the other one over there too. So that was something which I've always wanted, and decided I'd push the boat out and get those. And it's made a huge difference to my production values, but also the ease at which I can control the cameras when I'm making other content for other people as well. So it really does work quite well. And somebody said Stream Deck. Yep, Stream Deck. I have Companion running in the background. Companion is software, Stream Deck's the buttons, so you can command everything. And it's interesting that Ralph said, I thought you were standing in your videos for some reason. No, I'm sitting, definitely sitting. Thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate the comment on the studio. Yeah, a lot of hard work done since you started. Yeah, and it's interesting how it's evolved over time, because, of course, as I've got more sophisticated, when John started coming to the studio, and we then had green screens, so we have 2 green screens so we can actually make that work. I added some extra functionality there, and then when I've done other things too, I've added more functionality, and then of course I've had to upgrade as software changes, and then Windows 11, and so I've got a few computers under the desk here running different services. So there's a computer that allows me to run the overlays that's sort of here, so we can have the pre-show overlay running. That's a separate system. And then I've got another computer that allows me to generate this sort of content. That's basically a screen which is grabbed and then projected. And then I've got the other screen over here, which is where I'd have all my presentations or my Zoom, and that can come up. And then I've got, of course, the chat as well. So there are a number of different layers that you can mix and match and come and go when you actually run the studio. So all of that's part of it too. And he said, you made me smarter and aware. I'm glad that you actually have understood the importance of asking questions and digging in, and not just taking the first answer. I guess if there was one thing that I wanted to leave by way of a legacy, it would simply be the concept of not taking the first answer, asking harder questions and pushing a bit, because quite often people, when they're presenting information, have an agenda. And most of the mainstream economists have an agenda. They want you to sort of go and get more mortgages or whatever, right? So, and the property sector, of course, have a very strong agenda: buy more, buy now. So it is really important. The finance sector the same. So it's really important to be independent, objective. My training as a philosopher meant that I always kept asking more questions and going a bit further and trying to get to the next level and try and really understand what was going on. And of course, working with John on Interest of the People, we were able to do some quite good things around the cash ban and more recently the regional banking inquiry and other things too. And I guess the other point is that what's fascinating to me is that as we get more people more aware of what's going on, you can begin then to create some momentum, and you get people who actually start interacting with the community or with the politicians or with inquiries and putting submissions in, and then you can begin to shape the agenda. And I just want to celebrate the number of people who have put submissions in on all sorts of things over the last few years, thanks partly to listening to me and to people like Robbie and to John and some of my other guests, and making a difference. Because what fascinates me is that we can actually make a difference. We can actually influence the political debate. We can actually steer it in a particular direction. And the more that we can share and energize those particular initiatives, the more we can actually shape the future of the economy and politicians and even the RBA maybe as well. So those are important things, and it shows you, I think, the power of social media and what we can do. And Mars said, imagine rewiring all that. Good luck. Yeah, there's going to be some rewiring, but of course I won't build it all at once. I'll start with the small and then build out. So that's the way I did it this time. That's the way I'll do it again. So it will take some time to do all of that, though. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. He says he'll take over while you're gone. Okay, fine, carry on. Very good. Nothing beats an English country garden. Yes, actually, one of the things I'm looking forward to is actually gardening in English climate again. I quite enjoy gardening, and I'll get back to that. Really enjoy that. So the bulbs are out, just beginning to come out in the UK now. So I'll hopefully see some of those when I get back. Yeah, well, I'm a bit sad too, but I think I explained, and I will just explain again for those who may not fully get why I'm doing what I'm doing. I did make a show the other day called So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, where I actually explained in a bit more detail why I'm moving back to the UK. But I'll give you the potted version because it's quite important for you to understand. It's not that I've lost interest in doing DFA and all the work I'm doing. I'm still doing the surveys. I'm going to be doing more of that. But when I lost Jill, which is well over a year ago now, I wanted to try and give myself time to figure out what I was going to do next. And for the first sort of few months, it was just running around in ever-decreasing circles, dealing with the administration and dealing with the ATO and the banks. It was just, well, it was pretty hellish after, actually, just dealing with all the administration. But when that faded away, I started to try and sort of figure out in my own head, well, what did I want to do? And it became clear to me that I couldn't just stay in this big house on my own, and there were too many memories and there were too many things that took me back rather than forward. So basically my first decision was I needed to actually move from this property. And then the second question was, so where do I move to? And I started looking in and around the immediate area and other areas across Australia. But I'd been looking in the UK a little bit, and this particular property that I ended up buying was one I'd seen some time ago and was really just my sort of property in the right location, very close to friends and family, very close to green walks and parks and also National Trust land. And it's an area I know really well, and it's an area that's very close to Bath, and Bath is where my family and relatives are. So when I saw that property, that then triggered me to think, well, okay, maybe then I should go back to the UK. And when that started, big decision. It's like everything else just naturally followed, because basically I was able then to put this property in the market and got a reasonable price for it. And it's just like everything fell into place. And then I had somebody approach me from the UK saying, well, if you're ever in the UK, we'd love you to set up the surveys in the UK. And so that was another reason. So all of those things. So I just feel it's time to step out and, make a new start. And that's really what this is about. So it's not that I'm leaving DFA behind. It's not that I'm stopping doing the surveys or the analysis. I'm just doing it in a different context. And I'm trying to take a step forward and take a more positive turn, because honestly, the last year or so I felt pretty lost. And whilst it was okay just creating content, I didn't think there was sufficient purpose there to be able to actually justify just doing that. So that's really the sort of the rationale. And then the other thing that happened was I then investigated taking the dogs, because of course Jill had the dogs as a sort of a companion set for her as she was more and more spending time in bed and was less well. And so the dogs are a critical part of my life, and I couldn't leave the dogs, I couldn't hand them away. So when I found that I could bring the dogs to the UK without any quarantine, that was the other thing that sort of nailed it. So that's the reason. So it's not that I'm going to stop doing DFA, I'm just going to have a hiatus while I relocate and set the studio up again. I will go on making a few recorded shows over the next few weeks, and I will make the odd ad hoc video where I'm sort of showing a little bit about maybe the progress I'm making. But I won't be in a position to make the weekly live streams because all of this is coming apart. I've finished making the Interest of the People videos now, and so it's going to be a bit light on in terms of content, but I will be back, and my expectation is that I'll be still doing live stream shows, and I will try and re-establish them 8 p.m. Sydney time on a Tuesday. So that's my sort of master plan. So give me maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks or so, and hopefully we'll be back. So keep subscribing on the channel and you'll get notification. And there will be other shows. For example, tomorrow I'm interviewing Steve Mickenbecker, and we're going to talk a bit about the RBA. And I've got a couple of other short shows planned as well. But eventually my frequency of posting will degrade, and there will be a time when I won't be posting for a couple of weeks or so. So that's my plan. And I hope that makes a little bit of sense in terms of why I've done what I've done. And so there we are. I hope that helps to explain it. What else? Graham, thank you very much for that. Move the needle? Yeah. I actually think we have. I think we've actually had quite an influence. It's actually quite satisfying. You're a good antidote to the media. They rarely explain anything or ask difficult questions. Thank you. Well, I believe that those are really important set of questions. And, I believe that there's a big debate to be had about central bank digital currencies and other things, and I'll be continuing to. Interesting. Have some property experts stopped talking to you since your forecast turned negative? Actually, I've had more conversations with other people who actually think about it similarly now. There's much more alignment. In fact, I was on the Elephant in the Room podcast today with Chris Bates and Veronica Morgan. And in fact, we had a long discussion there. It'll come out in a few weeks about the trajectory of home prices, and we all agreed that prices are likely to continue to fall. So many of those people are on the same side of the equation now, I think. Jason, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate it. And hit the like, folks, absolutely. And look, I guess one of the things I want to say is I don't expect people to think the same way as I do, and I don't expect people to have the same views as I do. But frankly, if I help people to think for themselves and to basically ask questions and to form better informed opinions, then that really does help. Drew asks, what's my internet bandwidth? I had a gigabyte up and a gigabyte down here. I started when I did my first shows with ADSL, and that was about 80 up and 15 down. No, sorry, 80 down and 15 up, and that was a bit wobbly. But then I moved up to the gigabyte up, gigabyte down, and that allows me to then throw the edit videos up to YouTube in about a minute, which makes a lot of efficiency. Can I live stream from Leicester sometime? Well, you know, it's interesting because the UK is so small. I could certainly be travelling around and doing things in different locations. And, you know, if you've got particular suggestions, then feel free to make suggestions about what you'd like to see. And I actually think making some comparisons between the UK and Australia will be quite interesting too. So we're doing that. Adam said, "Are you being bullied to leave?" No, I'm not being bullied to leave Australia. It's my personal decision in my own interests, and as I explained, because I feel I need to break out and start something new. So no political or economic coercion anywhere. Madeline says the cash ban was a great win. Yes, it was. That was, I guess, the first time we actually exercised our, you know, social muscles, as it were. And thanks for that. Yeah, we'll hope we can get John Adams to continue to do some IOTP stuff, but he does have a few other issues with family and everything else, so we'll see. We'll get Leith back on. I think Leith is quite keen. Smooth says you should cable mark your equipment and thus just follow the assembly. Actually, everything is labelled. Believe it or not, I have a big spreadsheet which everything is labelled to everything. So I'm actually ahead of you on that one. So we should be able to make that work. And thank you, Jackie. I appreciate that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the new home. It's a lot smaller than this one. It's got plenty of space for what I need, but it's a lot smaller. And the location is pretty much perfect as well. White Rabbit, thank you for that. Appreciate the comments there. David says you'll be complaining about the English weather. Actually, probably not. I'm fully aware of English weather. You know, I spent many years in the UK before I came out to Australia. And as I said earlier on, actually the humidity is the thing that kills me in the summer, particularly now. So I think I'll prefer the cooler weather. But of course, in the UK, they do get the occasional heat wave, and everybody wilts because they're not prepared for it. So there we go. Ando says thank you. Farewell and good luck. Thank you for that. And Cookie Boy says, home is where the heart is. And you're right. That's certainly partly it is true. And I've got lots of relatives, some of whom I haven't seen for 10 years. And, you know, the fact is that sometimes a change is as good as a rest. So it's, yeah, exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. And 40% property inheritance tax in the UK kind of sucks. It does, indeed. But frankly, that wasn't my major consideration because really, you know, I want to spend the time I have doing the things I want to do in the place where I want to do it. You can't just be driven by just purely financial things. Chris says, have you bought a house in the UK? Yep, I have exchanged and I settle on the 27th of March. So that's, the time frame is 27th of March. I settle in the UK. The removers come here on the 27th and the 28th. I fly out on the 29th. I land on the 30th. And then the dogs arrive on the 4th of April. So it's all within a week or so. So there you go. That's the story. Thank you very much for that one. Lee Tran said, DFA International. Well, interestingly, I am going to be able to run the surveys in the UK, the US, hopefully, as well as Australia, and looking at Canada as well. So watch what may happen. Rosella says, good for you, Martin. We'll miss you. Thank you. Well, I'll miss the community here as well. And I hope that the community will stay intact and activated and will return when I return. Very, very grateful for all of those who've actually spent time with me over the years. I think we've built a pretty amazing community. Almost everybody who comes on as my guests remark on the amazing community that we've built here. And, that's all thanks to you guys and for all the humour and conversations and everything. So it's very important that we preserve that and continue it. So please do stay subscribed to the channel. And as I say, I'll be putting shows up from time to time. I will also continue some economic analysis because it's important that I'm up to date. And White Rabbit said, I'm about to walk the world. Indeed. Exactly right. The dogs in the videos are popular. Absolutely. Well, the dogs will continue. So, we'll have doggy cam in the UK. The truth is that the place I bought, the location I bought, I think is a relatively secure one from a financial perspective. But frankly, it was more than just a financial decision. But I also had a concern that the Australian scenario was likely to continue to deteriorate. I personally think the recession is quite likely in Australia. And I felt that we are probably going to see some bumps in the road here because I think economically we've got some issues. I think we're about 6 months behind the UK. So my theory is maybe the UK will begin to, turn around. And Otto said, whoops, I missed that one. Sorry, I've lost that. Let me just put that there. Fly the world. Fly the world. Yeah, well, maybe. I don't want to do a lot of flying, honestly. I don't particularly enjoy flying these days, but I may do some flying. We'll see. But of course, once you're in Europe, you can travel around Europe, on trains and things. So that's something I'll hopefully be doing a lot more of that. So you never know, you might see some live streams from other places as well. And we'll see where it goes. Yeah, you're probably right about that. Always watch DFA, yeah. Just do your research on the country you pick. You've done that, yeah. And thank you very much for that. Well, I try to be honest and straightforward. I don't have an agenda. People sometimes think that I'm a property bear, etc. No, I don't have an agenda. I'm just trying to call it as I think. And the UK is in terminal decline. Well, maybe, but then on the other hand, I would say that most economies around the world are in terminal decline, even Australia, I think. So I think we've all got the same malaise. And sure, there are risks. There's a risk of war, etc. But then you've got the risk of war with China. So, we all have our issues, don't we? That's really the point. So I don't think anywhere is safe and secure. I think anywhere is at risk. But for me personally, at this point in my life, I made the decision that the UK was going to be where it was. Well, I think that's pretty much what I want to cover tonight. So if there are any other last minute questions, I agree with you. Australia is going downhill. When I arrived here nearly 30 years ago, I was amazed how equal the economy was and how everybody was optimistic and positive. It's been wrecked, frankly, really wrecked badly. And I'm afraid that what I'm seeing are the continued signs of a deterioration in the local economy. The politicians don't actually want to deal with the real issues, and that's a big deal. So there you go. Warwick is asking, yes, in due course, my plan is to replicate the modelling and to do the same sorts of things that I'm doing here. My plan is to continue to do the Australian research and analysis and modelling, but do similar things in other locations too. Not least because I want to be able to do some compare and contrast. I think there's some really interesting stories about, let's look at the UK versus Australia versus Canada versus the US, for example. Thanks, Graham, for that. And Kerry, yeah, beautiful gardens. Yeah, there are lots of wonderful places in Bath. And yeah, thanks, Drew, for that. So let's just look at that one. Australia is not going downhill. Well, it's a matter of opinion, isn't it? And yeah, Bath is a great place to visit. If anybody's coming across the UK and you've got time to look me up in Bath, just send me a note via the DFA blog. And always happy to have a chat or drop me a note. Again, on the blog, you can use the message there. Somebody asked about small business. Yeah, I've got my data on small business. I will do a post. Not sure when, but I am going to do a small business post, so I'll answer that question. But yes, there are businesses that are absolutely very much stuffed, I'm afraid. And Osborne Digital Marketing. Hi, Ronald. Yeah, that's an interesting question. What would you like to see on my new website? Because we are doing a website rebuild as part of this. So if you've got any ideas about things you'd like to see added into the website, let me know. Ronald's helped me with the rebranding and the rebuilding. What will be your first meal in Bath? Probably a Bath bun. And I don't know about Edwin joining me in the UK, but we're certainly going to do the monthly shows. And Richard asked, how easy was it to move wealth? Actually, relatively simple. I already had a bank account in the UK, and I've been able to transfer funds. I actually was able to pick my exchange rate quite easily as well. So it's been quite straightforward. There are some confusions with the tax regimes, but we'll sort that out as we go. And have a nice trip. I'm looking forward to the shows produced in Bath. Yeah, well, I'll perhaps do a little bit of the Bath area. And yeah, I never say never. I may well be back. So I've still got interest in Australia, and I've still got some significant reasons to want to continue to connect with people here too, because I have friends here too. But all my family is in the UK, so I couldn't persuade them to come out here. Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate that and the super chat. Thank you. And yeah, it's easy to get your assets and money seized in the UK as everywhere, but there you go. There we go. Well, I think that's pretty much it. So look, I want to say thank you all very much for coming on tonight and sharing with me the final fling for now. And just to reiterate, this is temporary. I will be back on the show. I will be making more shows. I will be doing more live streams. And as always, very interested to get feedback and suggestions as to things to cover. And hopefully we'll be able to introduce you to some new guests from the UK as well and other places, and also bring on some of the guests that we've had on recently and continue the discussion. So stay safe. Thank you very much indeed for supporting me and my work, and for sharing your thoughts and opinions and coming on the Tuesday evening and enjoying participation in the chat. Really appreciate it. Keep safe. Keep financially alert and aware. Remember that some of the things that the government says is only partially true, so just check that. And I hope that you will be able to keep safe and secure, and I'll look forward to having a live stream with you in a few weeks' time. In the meantime, enjoy the occasional recorded show, keep safe, and thanks very much for spending so much time with me on Walk the World. So this is Martin North, signing off for the moment. Take care. We'll see you soon. Cheerio.